Go. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining our panel. My name is Cade Peterson, and I'm moderating a panel called Games Times Comics, Complementary Mediums. Together with us, we have a nice, wonderful collection of people that have worked on telling new stories from different existing franchises and expanding the mediums, or expanding franchises across mediums. And just to start it off, like I said, my name is Cade Peterson. I work for a little indie game studio called MidBoss, and we are known for the franchise called Read Only Memories. And I will just go around the room one at a time and ask you to do an introduction. Sam, would you mind going first?
Yeah, sure. Hi, everybody. My name's Sam Meggs. I write books, comics, and video games, largely for established IPs. So I work with John at IDW on comics like Marvel Action Captain Marvel, Transformers, My Little Pony. I have worked with Mary Kenney at Insomniac Games on games like Marvel's Spider-Man and many other franchise games that I can't talk about yet, but are happening, and novels that are also IP related. My most recent was Marvel's The Unstoppable Wasp. So yeah, lots of IP work across lots of different mediums.
Awesome. Mary, since she mentioned you, how about you go next?
A segue, yeah. Hi, I'm Mary Kenney. I write video games, comics, and recently announced I'm writing a book as well. I'm currently working on Spider-Man Miles Morales for PS5, so very familiar with inheriting a big beloved franchise and working very hard on it. I've written a few short stories set in the Read Only Memories universe for IDW Comics, and I also write My Little Pony comics for IDW.
I'm just going to go down in the order on my screen. I don't know if it's the same order for everyone else, but how about you, John? A little intro about yourself and how you
Sure.
Cool.
Hi, I'm John Barber. I'm the editor-in-chief at IDW Publishing. I've written a bunch of like Transformer stuff in my life. I used to be an editor at Marvel. I didn't play video games from the time I was in like middle school through about 3.5 years ago, when I decided that now being in my 40s with a young child is probably the best time to get into the medium. And I really totally fell in love with the medium in a way, way beyond even what I had before. So it's been like a lot of education for me and a lot of learning about stuff. It's funny because I'd worked with people who had worked on games, and I'd done adaptations of games that I hadn't read or played. I mean, I didn't read the adaptations I made either. But it's a lot of fun to get to work with everybody, and I'm excited to be here.
Great. Anne, how about you?
Hi, I'm Anne Toole. I'm a writer based in Los Angeles, and like many here, I write across media. So last year I wrote a comic based on Halo. It's a sequel to Halo set in the Halo universe. And I recently started working on the Horizon Zero Dawn comics. This just came today, so I'm excited. This is issue 2. And I worked on the original game for Horizon Zero Dawn, so that's exciting. And I also do work in other media, such as animation. So I worked on Cannon Busters, an anime show that is on Netflix. And it was recently announced I am contributing to a Star Wars anthology for the 40th anniversary of The Empire Strikes Back. So that's me, games, comics, animation, and short fiction. Haha. So that's me.
You're covering all the bullets there. How about you, Sina?
Hi, my name is Sina Grace, and I feel so tiny in comparison to all of you heavyweights. You all have amazing resumes, but I write a lot of comics. One of the more recent ones is the Read Only Memories comic for IDW that is based off the lovely game franchise, all of it. And something that I think pertains to this panel too is I used to be a comic book editor, and I worked for Robert Kirkman's Skybound imprint at Image Comics. And so when I was there, we had kind of kicked off that Walking Dead game with Telltale Games, and I was very involved for the first chapter of that game. And actually, I take a lot of credit for that deal coming through, because I really liked Sam and Max, and so I was like, hey guys, we have to have this conversation with them. Anyway, but we can get into that later.
Awesome. And JJ.
Hi, I'm John James, also known as JJ. I worked as the director and lead artist and animator for Read Only Memories at MidBoss. Now I'm the creative director over at MidBoss and currently working on the sequel to Read Only Memories, Neurodiver, as both the director again, as well as the lead artist and animator.
Awesome. Okay. Well, I'm just going to dive in, everyone, and start to get to some meaty questions. Okay. So I'm just going to throw the questions out, and then if anybody has a particularly strong interest to want to go first, just like let me know somehow, raise a hand, or just speak up.
Just scream. Sorry.
Whatever. So when it comes to games times comics, are they complementary? Like, that's the whole question. Can you further enhance a franchise by taking it from one medium to another? Are there drawbacks or gotchas that, you might have surprised you or that maybe others should be aware of? Go ahead, Anne.
Yeah, I think that definitely complementary is the way to go about it, because with comics, when I'm working on these comics IP, I definitely try to do things that you can't do in the game. So for example, I'll have like costume changes and hairstyle changes, and really have like character moments that maybe don't translate well in a game but work really well in a comic. But by the same token, I really like to celebrate the medium that they came from. So for the Halo Lone Wolf comic, I made sure it starts off in a level that the hardcore players have played through a million times in multiplayer. So it was a lot of fun seeing them being like, I know that level. So like a little call out. And in the Horizon comics, definitely obviously using established characters, but also kind of showing the gameplay in comic book format is a really, really nice nod. And that's actually kind of what I liked about the Witcher TV series, for example, because it honored the source material, which is the books, but it also honored the game because it still has a lot of the gameplay in it. So that's what I think is definitely, it complements it. It allows you to do more things, but it still lets you honor where it came from.
And then I think that the opposite is also true, where if you're taking something like Spider-Man that was a comic and making it into a video game, reading or watching a film is sort of a passive exercise, whereas playing a video game is a very active exercise. So suddenly you have the added element of player input. And in some cases with some games, like games that Mary and I have worked on, player choice, of course, is also an element of that. Although that also comes into linear games, players can choose the way in which they do things, not necessarily a dialogue tree or whatever, but adding that element of active or like activity for the person consuming the narrative, there's just that sort of extra connection. Like I feel more connected with characters in a video game than I do necessarily with characters in something in a book, because I feel like there's a part of me in them. So figuring out a cool way to take a character who's as established as Peter Parker, who always has certain traits about him that are always true, but then also find a way to incorporate players' individual selves or choices into that is really an interesting and cool way to keep the character fresh, I think.
Completely agree, because it goes from watching Peter Parker, admiring Peter Parker, to feeling like you are, like you understand what he's going through because you're doing it. What is it like to swing through a skyscraper? We know what it's like to look at someone swinging through a skyscraper, but to actually do it, that's something that only games can do. So it's
or
a really
crawl through a vent,
or crawl through a bunch of vents while people tell you the plot. Like that could happen too. Yeah, and I mean, so I also worked on the final season of The Walking Dead, weirdly enough, small world, and it's very similar. It's, I see what all these characters did in this usually horrific situation, but what would my character do? And it gives you this deeper understanding of the world and the stakes that I feel like you can't get anywhere else. So it's really fun.
Yeah, if I can also add real quickly too, there's like a very interesting play between both in terms of the concept of like zooming in, zooming out. I feel like when you're reading a comic, you can kind of like direct the artist to really zoom in on things, or even as a writer, one thing I've noticed, because I've been playing a lot of Nintendo Switch in quarantine, as Cade will know from our direct messages. But, you know, it's funny because like a game like, you know, Pokemon or Persona 5, the main character actually doesn't have a lot of interior thought because it's you, like everyone's saying. And then when you get to read a comic, depending on how it's written, with a game and book like Read Only Memories that's noir, you get a lot of the protagonist's interior thought that is, you know, given to the reader by the writer. And it's great because both offer different ways for you to zoom into this world and look at things. You know, whether it's a book kind of being like, all right, double page spread on this one moment, or a video game being like, and now we're going to go talk to this character and learn everything about this one level or one scene. Anyway, yeah, just my 2 cents to it too.
Yeah, it was funny. After I played the Spider-Man video game, I went to New York Comic Con. Like I finished it right before New York Comic Con that year, whatever that was, a couple of years ago. And I lived in New York for about 8 years, but I was still walking around New York. I'm like, oh, that's that place from the video game. I know that place. It was like it was so immersive and so much made me feel like Peter. I think there's something to a particular type of game that can get turned into a comic, or comic that can get turned into a game, in the way the audience interacts with it. You know, it isn't necessarily the numbers of people, it's the way they, you know, the way you deal with it that you know, like I think there are some games that are very, very big that people, just like anything else, just like taking a TV show that might be very, very big, but you don't have that personal connection to it. It's a thing you do with your friends on the weekend, or it's a thing, if it's TV shows, you know, running in the background, versus the things that are maybe don't have the same audience numbers, but have a greater thing where you want to learn more about the world and the characters and the lore. And, you know, it's why Doctor Who makes more sense in comics than like CSI does, you know. And I think that's you know, some of them can be big AAA games, some of them can be smaller indie games. My theory was that we'd hit some stuff with smaller indie games where you have you're very into it, like I was with Read Only Memories, right? And I wanted to know more about the world. But like, yeah, I feel like it's only recently with me, you know, maybe with like Arkham and Walking Dead, you know, and then definitely with Spider-Man, where there's been times where I've like played a game and I'm like, oh, this is as good or better than the comic, you know, like I just, you know, because I was very, I mean, obviously I haven't been playing them very long, but I'm also very sort of snobbish about that. I'm like, oh, I love these comics, and it's wild to see that come through in a game, you know, just everything I love about it being up there, as well as that interaction.
I was gonna say, like, one thing that I can add to this part is history, and this is kind of like broad knowledge in the games industry anyway, but a lot of times when there's a game made based off of, like, oftentimes a movie is like the most common one, it's usually like an afterthought. It's usually just to like eke out some more like merch bucks from the super fans or whatever. And because they don't usually get a large, or, you know, an ample enough budget to do a good job, and they also don't really have whoever's in charge of making the calls doesn't necessarily put the right people that care enough to make it a really spectacular game. Historically, most of the time they were like horrible adaptations. But I'm so glad to see that this trend has been changing in the last, I don't know, 5-10 years. I think I've seen it. And so when you continue, as games have become more and more narrative heavy, I think this is wonderful, because when you get the right writers in the right places, you can start to tell these new stories in a whole new medium that really serves the whole franchise amazingly well, and ultimately, you know, pleases the fans to a level that they could, you know, beyond their dreams. So I'm so glad to see that people are looking at expanding the media across mediums, not just for a quick buck, but actually to make something really good. JJ, did you have any thoughts there or anything, just since I haven't asked you to talk yet?
Well, I mean, as far as games going to comics goes, at least with Read Only Memories, I never have really been too fond of adaptations. And whenever it came to us going into comics, it was a great opportunity to expand the universe more, explore these characters, because one of the biggest regrets I have about our game, at least, was that it was the perfect example of like min-maxing character development. where we have 4 really strong looking characters, and instead we just kind of dumped all of the character development into Turing, and then we left 3 characters mostly as exposition dumps. And now with these comics, we were able to expand on Lexi's story, expand on like, what is Tomcat doing? What's Lexi doing? What are all these other characters doing? And kind of make them more human. So it was nice expanding that universe, also giving more freedom to like, what can we do with these characters? I just like comics as supplementary things. They're really fun.
If I may add one more thing, I feel so bad. Half this panel is just going to be this one question. But the other thing that I'm realizing in hearing everyone's answers and talking about this is, I think with comic books, you have more liberty to have artist interpretations. Like with Read Only Memories, the game has a very specific style, and in the backups that was honored. But then for the comic, we had Stefano Simeone. I don't know how to say his last name, but this awesome Italian artist Stefano draw the book, and his art is really gestural and loose. And when you make a video game, you kind of have to land on like 1, maybe 2 styles for gameplay and then cinematics for the rest of the game, if not the entirety of the game's franchise. And in comic books, it's great because you're like, okay, I can have a cover artist, I can have an interior artist, we can swap out artists. And I just remember growing up and buying PlayStation magazines specifically for the comic artist covers to see how someone would interpret like Mortal Kombat characters outside of what was designated, within the video game. They're both art forms, is all I'm saying, and that there's an interesting value on both sides because you can get really sweeping, cool stuff in games, but then you can get a lot of like hyper individualized interpretations in comic books.
I think generally you have a lot more creative freedom in comic books as well. And any artists watching this, I'm really sorry, but like I'm so much more limited in a game. The example I always use is like, I have this story and it's about 7 unicorns and it's going to be like amazing. This story about these 7 unicorns on an adventure together. And if I'm making a comic book, I can just be like, hey, draw 7 unicorns, and my artist will hate me, but they will draw this comic book about 7 unicorns essentially. Like it just takes their hand and brain power, and we work with brilliant artists in this industry, so no problem for them. They're amazing. But in a video game, if I'm like, I have this story about 7 unicorns and like 8 guys in rigging are like, we actually only have a model for a goat. So can this be a story about 8 goats? And you're like, yeah, man, okay, fine. 7 goats. It's no problem. 7 goats. And then somebody on programming is like, we really only have the memory space to support 1 character on the screen at a time. So can your story about 7 unicorns actually be a story about 1 goat? And you have to be like, yeah, totally. I mean, sure. And then like 8 guys in charge of your video game company don't like goats, and then the 14 guys who own the IP that you're making, like they love goats, and then they're both giving you like conflicting goat information, and you're kind of like, I don't know what to do with this. And then the gameplay guys are like, goats aren't fun, and then you're like, I don't know, okay, don't make goats. So you're like, in a game can be anywhere from like 40 to 1,200 people making this thing, right? And they all have to agree with the thing that you're making, and technically it all has to work within the confines of like your engine and whatever like medium you're working in. So in a comic, it's basically like you, your artist, and your editor, and you're just like, whatever, man, like make whatever I want. So yeah, games I think have a lot of potential. I mean, I think games are the medium of our generation, of our moment. They have so much potential, and millions of people play them. Millions of people do not read comics anymore. Tragedy, but true. Like, but in comics, you have so much more freedom.
Yeah, and I mean, there's another element too, and it's the player. Even in a single player game, if you're thinking, okay, and then Clementine is gonna leap across this hillock and it's gonna look dope, she's gonna draw her cleaver, like you're pitching that in a game, and they're like, yeah, but what if she just walks around the hillock? Well, now what? I don't know. Then we have to do something else. But in a comic, you just, you talk to the artist and say, and then she leaps and it's cool. And there it is. It's a little more static, so you can set up and pay off like character arcs and really artistic, cool moments. Whereas in a game, it's harder because, well, what if the player, you know, yeeted off for 20 minutes and did another quest? Now they don't remember any of the setup. Like, you know, that's something you constantly have to kind of plan for, which is really fun. But like in a comic, sometimes it's fun to just be like, I know exactly how they're going to read it or how they will probably read it. So.
One of the challenges I have though with games versus comics, with games, there's less like, oh, is this going to take 15 minutes or 16 minutes? It's pretty much all the same. But with comics, you can't just add 2 pages. Like you can't just add. So it's very strict in that regard. And so in games, like the action goes really fast. But in comics, that actually restricts your storytelling. I mean, obviously, the actions should also be storytelling. They're not mutually exclusive. But if you want to have like a heartwarming scene, well, you're competing with the action, which takes up more space, and you can't, it's just really inflexible space-wise, while games is a little more flexible.
Yeah, it's the thing I always tell like writers coming in from other mediums, you know, especially from like TV or something, that if you write, you know, somebody's driving a car, they slam on the brakes, stop the car and jump out. Like that's like less than a second of screen time, but that's a full page of a comic book if you actually show those actions. That's, you know, that's 5% of a regular sized issue. You know, just in terms of like showing a moving car versus it being a static car in a medium where nothing is moving, showing it going from moving to not moving. You know, if you show that foot, if you show the door open, you know, all those things slow things down so much. Like, the action slows down in comics tremendously. If you're trying to play that stuff out. Yeah, it's a really interesting point.
The best comics advice I ever got was in a panel description. If you ever write the word "and," you messed up. Because the character can't do this thing and this thing. They can't stand up and high five someone. Like, they have to stand up and then in the next panel high five someone. And I think to Anne's point as well, there's almost like the opposite of that in video games too, which is you're limited in time in video games. The only way you're limited in time in video games as a creative is in the amount of cutscenes that you have. Normally you have a budget of like 30 minutes or whatever, and those cutscenes are almost always dedicated to like big action set pieces, because largely video game studios, largely video game studios
like 30 minutes. Oh, psych! Now you only have
17. And if you try to go in and be like, and this cutscene is going to be just about feelings, all the people who run the video game studios are like, no. So the time for, like, to JJ's point, like deep character development in video games, it's very hard to find that, I think.
I think we do sometimes with the timing of video games get a little more opportunity, which is nice. Like optional content is something that's not in a comic book, right? I don't get a comic book and then they're like, also here's 7 more pages in case you want to know more about that one random like one-off character. But games are like, well, we have a whole side quest over there. If you really like this character, you can go learn more about it. So that's one way that it is nice, and it can get a little bit deeper. But it also is a reason why I love working on or with adaptations is like, after playing Read-Only Memories, I wanted to know everything about these characters. I wanted to know what they had for breakfast. I wanted to know all this stuff. And we could finally do it, you know, and see different aspects of this universe, like in a comic, which is great.
I was going to say, like, as a non-writer, probably the only one here, I'm always fascinated, or not fascinated, I'm always impressed, like, when you can tell a story in such a short amount of time that a standard floppy is, and then the ones that do it so well, they're just like boom, no problem, they can tell this really cool like story in a whole like issue. Because I tend to be verbose when I speak, or just in general, and so I couldn't even imagine trying to be like learn to be concise and tell compelling stories that are rich, deep, and like hold your attention and like excite people and, you know, do all those good things in such a short format. But it clearly, basically what I'm saying is I think that if you can do it well for comics, you can easily do it for probably other mediums. I don't know, kudos to you comic writers, basically. I think we covered that one pretty well. Here's the next one. Do you have any favorite things that you've worked on, comics, games, or whatever, like that you personally enjoyed, and were there any hard or weird to translate issues? We kind of touched on that when it comes to the transmedium issues, like going from comics to games with all the stakeholders and the technical issues. But were there any other things that we haven't touched on? in terms of translating one thing to another medium?
For me,
I'll start.
probably. Oh yeah, please, Sina.
Mine's just really funny and quick, so that way it sets a different tone. Thank you. But no, in the Read Only Memories comic, I wanted to like nod to the decision making of the game, but you can't do that when the reader is passive in the process. And so I just made a joke instead about it, where our character Lexi is trying to get into an establishment, and in the game at one point it's literally like, well, maybe you can find something to like butter up this guy, and I think you literally find like donuts on the ground, and so because I couldn't create that moment within the book, I created a joke where Lexi's like, oh, and there are like no donuts on the ground for me to give him. So that wasn't as like juicy a story as you'd want, but I just thought it was a really funny throwaway joke to put in.
Donuts would work on me. Like that would fully work on me. No matter what you want to bribe, that's gonna work. Mine is not a comic into video game story. It's actually comic into novels. I adapted The Unstoppable Wasp into a novel. It was originally a comic. She's a comic book character, and into a novelization, long form YA novel. And the biggest challenge, and the thing I went back and forth with the most with the amazing editors at Marvel, was the fight scenes, because they wanted every fight scene in the novel to feel like a Marvel movie fight scene. So I'm dealing with like 3 mediums basically of competing, like how do you make a book scene feel like Marvel Spider-Man, video game also feel like Civil War, like how do you make it feel that fast-paced, kinetic, like with that amount of motion, while also taking advantage of the fact that you're working in a novel, which the whole point is to get like that extra interiority where you can figure out like, how does it feel to be a superhero? How does it feel for Ant-Man or the Wasp to like shrink and then move in slow motion? Like, so balancing that, the slower pace of like the interiority with this desire or need for it to be as kinetic as a Marvel video game or movie was like an incredibly difficult challenge, I found.
Wasp leaps into the air, and it kind of looks CG, but it's pretty cool. You don't let it bother you because it's there's a lot going on.
I imagine like the different stakeholders at each medium. You know, if you're talking about like book publishers versus gameplay or game studios versus movies. Like if you ever adapted something to a movie, I imagine the stakeholders all have very different expectations, and they all kind of probably haven't necessarily done this sort of project, you know, adaptation of a franchise. Maybe some have, maybe some haven't, but like I would imagine that there's a lot of advantage if the people in charge of the one receiving medium had possibly perchance worked in the previous medium that they were adapting it to. But I don't imagine that that happens quite a lot, especially at the level of a stakeholder where they, you know, the decision makers that are going to be like approving stuff or not. But maybe there are, and maybe that's why the adaptation stuff is getting better quality. I'm hoping so. That's my theory. Did anybody else have any answers for that particular question about favorite things you've adapted, or things that were particularly hard to do to translate from one to another? Sounds like that one was really tricky, and
I've got one more thing, because I'm remembering like a lot of the Walking Dead stuff, which is what's interesting again. And we've all been talking about how comic books are like 3 to 5 people making this thing, and it's all just like, you know, what inspires the other person to do crazy cool stuff. And then video games are like 40 to 1,000 people or whatnot. And I just remembered when The Walking Dead was expanding into tabletop gaming and video games, we were constantly being like, okay, we were getting these requests for like style guides and like, you know, folders of assets and stuff. And again, it was like, it's Robert Kirkman and his artist Charlie Adlard, and then this guy Cliff Rathburn doing gray tones. Like, it's just 3 dudes. And we were just like, what do you mean style guide? Like, we just tell Charlie to draw the zombies and then it's done in gray. And they're like, well, what color gray do you use? Like, we're like, the gray. Like, so it was really a really quick and fun and thrilling, challenging experience to like have to corral these guys' minds and have them explain what they're doing and how this magic works for other people to then translate it, you know, and come up with house styles of their own. So that was an interesting challenge, taking this thing that was very small and boutique and then trying to find a way to kind of communicate its magic on a broader platform and broader level.
That made me just realize something that I think should definitely be said. As someone who's not part of the creative stuff, just kind of like worked with an adaptation, and I think JJ can agree with me here, but I think when you do want to take something from one medium to another, you know, you want to choose like people that you feel have the right style or have the right chops to do what, you know, do a good job. But I think there needs to be something said about like letting them have the freedom to do it without micromanaging and killing the project sometimes just by like over, you know, getting too involved, and just like let your creatives just kind of run with it. Choose them wisely, and then, you know, make sure there's a good editor or whatever like that, but then like just see what they come up with. And if they truly did, you know, their homework and like love the particular franchise as much, then they're probably going to do a good job. And so I just want to put that out there, that I think that the leap of faith perhaps is definitely something important, and something that I feel like paid off, at least for us at least. And I'm very pleased with the output. Like,
yeah, I don't want to name names, but that is not necessarily the case with all video game developers when they work with comic book companies.
I was gonna say, a lot of people probably don't do that, but we, MidBoss, we were like, let's see what happens, you know, because we were involved in the process of like the writer selection, artist selections. You know, we went over lots of stuff. We had you all send us like a box load of previously published books just so we could look at art styles and, you know, all these things. And then I think when we were choosing the writer, go ahead, JJ. But
I think at least in our case, it was easy for us because it was kind of the same way with us as far as The Walking Dead, the comic goes, where like, since I was the one main artist on the project for a majority of it, if I was thinking of a character or something, I would just draw it. Or whenever it came to a background, I would just draw it. So that led us to not really have a style guide at all to give anybody. So whenever it came down to like picking the artist and everything, I did have stuff in mind. But as soon as we were shown Stefano's art, it just blew me away. And so it was like, yeah, let's just go with this interpretation of this art and like have something different. But it has been challenging going forward, having to actually sit and think about these characters and these designs, and if we need to actually build a proper style guide later.
probably, the answer is probably.
Yeah, probably.
Fortunately, we in our case, we have tons of like art just in troves everywhere, but you have put together an art book for the previous game, so that helped as well. But yeah, but like Stefano's art style is loose and sketchy, and it's very there's not a really great way that I could describe his style, but to me, what caught my attention was that it felt loose but precise at the same time, and it had extremely playful use of color in a way that gives the whole thing a very dynamic feel, and that felt right on the money. And it was definitely not a particular artist style that I would have thought that we would love so much, but it just, like, as soon as we both looked at it, JJ and I looked at each other, we're like, this is the one. Like, absolutely no questions. So sometimes you might be surprised at what you find and you like, but I don't know. I think we, in many ways, so many ways, got lucky with just everything. Like, everything just came together, and we've been just super pleased with the results in every way. Like, would not change a thing. So,
I mean, I think one of the things, I mean, it was like working with you guys, you know what I mean? This wasn't like working with your marketing department, or working with the worst job at your marketing department. And it was by, I mean, like, this got started because I played the game and I liked it a lot, and I emailed you guys, and you know, and I mean, Stefano came in, Megan and I almost literally ran into each other in the hallways. We were both going to tell each other we should use Stefano, the whole thing came together. I guess you too, Sina. No, I'm just kidding. And Sina, obviously Sina was such a big, huge part of it too, and there was no argument on that one either. It was that was great. But it was just everybody involved in it cared about it and happened to be pretty close to it to whatever degree, from whatever angle they're coming in. Like this wasn't. We were working with the people who made the thing, not not just somebody who doesn't want to get in trouble 2 weeks from now when somebody sees something and somebody's knee pad has vertical stripes instead of horizontal ones, and that makes the sort of notes and sort of interaction with you guys very different.
Maybe it's the truth. Working with indies, do it. More of it. It's easier. Cool. Any other thoughts on that one before I move on? Anyone?
Yeah, I just wanted to chime in. It was different when I rolled on to Walking Dead because we were at season 4 by then. But even then, I mean, we had certain rules. Like, these are rules of the universe. You do not violate these rules. If you do violate these rules, we will throw out your script and you will write a new script. Like, it was pretty strict at that point. But at the same time, what Skybound did really well and why I really liked working with them, it was, these are rules of the world, and then that's it. And then you can do what you want. Like, you can create the characters you want, you can create the spaces you want, but here's where we're at this point in the timeline of the apocalypse. And that was really fantastic because that gives you enough of a box that you're not gonna go off and be like, and then aliens came and fought all the zombies. But you do, you've got your box, but now you can build within it. And that was really helpful. So totally agree the point. You need to trust your creators and choose them wisely, but also giving them some rules is good because you don't want to wait until they have like their third draft of their script and be like, oh, just kidding, none of that's gonna work, bye. but just giving them that space to play in it really leads to the best stuff every single time.
Yeah, it's funny, like working with someone who's like an editor-in-chief for a comic like John, or the people in comics, like their primary mode, the thing that they all deal in is story. Like, comics are about the art and they're about the writing, and both those things together make a story. And that's like, I feel like everyone involved in comics is or has been, like many of the people on this panel, an editor of story. They've spent their entire professional careers thinking about story and narrative, and the way in which art and writing complement each other to deliver that narrative. But like, it's primarily a story-driven medium, whereas a challenge in video games is that a lot of the people in charge at game studios are not story people. They're engine people, or they're programmers, or they're guys who really like read a book about story once and are like sure that they're story people now, but like aren't, you know what I mean? And often they'll deliver you this sort of list of rules of like, game people like to have rubrics. We like to measure things in the same way that we could measure, like, say, and the way that a pixel looks on the screen. Like, oh, it's not sharp enough, we got to get it up to this level or whatever. They like to measure storytelling the same way. So something I've experienced at a ton of different game studios is leadership that thinks they've like unlocked the key to whatever good storytelling is, like whether that be Robert McKee's story or Dan Harmon's story circle or Kurt Vonnegut's like graphs or whatever, and they'll be like, this is the rubric to good storytelling. Every mission must follow the rules that Robert McKee set forth in his holy tome or whatever. And it's like, nah. Whereas in comics, like, that never happens. People are just like, tell a good story, and the way that you get there is very organic, and you can tell what, comics are so experimental. You can tell whatever kind of story. There's room for all these different kinds of stories, as opposed to in games where you get a lot of people who don't really understand story trying to control the people responsible for the story, and often that doesn't go great, which is, I think, to Cade's point, where like a lot of the time things have not worked out, but we're getting better about it. But yeah, that's why like comics can be a lot easier for writers, I think.
Oop, are we on fire?
Not me.
That's all the video game companies I've ever worked for coming to shoot me down.
It's like some draconian PR team is coming for you. Sorry, you can tell I've like been put through the fire of a previous company as well. The next one is kind of like a natural one. How has fan reception been to anybody that's adapted something to another? Did people love it? Did they hate it? Did they surprise you with like something in between? I'm just curious about feedback because like with our comic series, I literally have seen nothing but 100% positive reviews on them. So I'm like, that was easy, but no, it wasn't. But how is everybody else in terms of their experiences? Go ahead, Anne.
Definitely on both Halo and Horizon, it has been very positive across the board. And last year, Halo had 343, the company that owns Halo, had a countrywide rotating convention, and I actually went to 2 incarnations of it, and it was just Halo fans being all in. And I was signing comics next to the novelists who had worked on the novelizations and tie-ins. And we had people so excited. Like, I've done signings before, but I'm not like that big a deal. But the people who reacted to me signing there, they were like, I'm so excited. They were so excited because the Halo Lone Wolf focuses on this character, Linda, who's a little underserviced in, especially in the games, because obviously you're playing a different main character, but she wasn't serviced that much in the novels as well. So this was a chance for her to shine, and so people were so excited. And I after one signing, I was like, I don't think I will ever get anyone that excited to get my signature in my life. They were all in, very, very positive.
I haven't seen anything bad about read-only memories either, knocking on wood. And then the other 2 examples I have are, I used to intern at this comic book. I was an editorial intern at Top Cow Productions when they had the Tomb Raider IP. And it goes back to everything we've been saying, which is like, if you're a fan of this thing, then you're probably going to do a great job adapting it. And Top Cow, everyone there loved playing the Tomb Raider game because everyone there was making comic books about scantily clad, buxom, powerful women. And that is Tomb Raider is, at that time, and Tomb Raider has developed into this really crazy thing in the past like 7 to 10 years. But it just was a perfect fit because all these guys did for a living was draw like really hot ladies with weapons. And so, I never saw complaints until, maybe a fill-in artist wasn't to the standard of the previous artist. And same with the Walking Dead game, it was received really well because I think what people love about the Walking Dead is you always ask yourself like, well, what would I do in an apocalypse? Like who would I be? What kind of character would I be? And then that Telltale game, you literally get to answer that question by making these decisions. Well, who would I be? Who would I save? What would I grab? What would I do? And so of course it just, blew fans' minds up. And I think Telltale, it's funny because at the time the perception was like, let's try and get a sexy, developer that's, like on PlayStation, Xbox, whatever. And Telltale is a smaller operation than that. And it just turned out to be for the better because I think, again, you would only get that kind of intimate type of story through them and not really, that wouldn't really happen if you were, I don't know, if you had like Square making that game for you.
Yeah, that's definitely a fair point. And especially at the time, when Telltale was doing it, because they're not like a AAA studio, they're more like, at the time they were probably like barely AA, and that's just like a studio in terms of like what is the average units they sell. AA, AAA is kind of a relative thing, but the actual number of people that worked there at the time was, definitely not like a 300-person studio that, Insomniac or any of the Sony first-party studios, like those can be massive. But they do good work, and they definitely put a lot of love and attention and work into it. Despite their now known flaws, they definitely had a lot of really talented people that really cared and they had a passion for it. And I think it showed through. Anybody else have any feedback or? Oh, you were. I'm sorry. You
No,
were.
it's okay. I'm on this weird delay. No, I mean the great thing about Telltale that is not normal in the games industry is that it was a story first studio. It was the story is everything, and we will build out everything else from there. And it's much more. It's very similar to how it's been in comics, how it's been with the book. Is like first the story has to be good, and then we're going to figure out how to make everything else great. The art and the story will work together. Whereas other game studios where I've worked, I mean, the worst example is whole game and then bringing a writer in to slap a story on it. And it's like, all right, make this emotionally resonant. And you're like, no, like, hey, I don't think I can do that. But I do think the last 5 to 10 years, in addition to video games choosing the right partners in terms of Marvel and DC and Skybound, it's also that game studios and publishers have been realizing for years now that story needs to really be, if not first, right next to gameplay. They need to be best friends. Like that needs to be, those two need to work hand in hand, and the player has to enjoy both. Or, even if it's a fun game, but like it just doesn't have a story, it might be fun, but is it going to be memorable? Maybe not. And so I think that both of those things happening at the same time is really good for all of us who are video game fans, and definitely for those of us who are comic fans. So
I was gonna say, like, it's funny that you brought that part up about like narrative having to, or ideally being like placed on a pedestal, like if at the same level, if not, close to it as actual gameplay. And I have to agree strongly. I feel like, and I actually got into a sort of a Twitter fight about 10 years ago with a very famous game designer who the hill he was going to die on is that like narrative is absolutely not necessary, and gameplay is the only thing that he values whatsoever. The gameplay needs to be like fun and and like visceral and all that stuff. And I'm not going to name him, but based on the games he designs and made, like they're very intense, combat heavy, action heavy, and they do make you feel like intense. But he just literally was like, narrative is just fluff extra. And I was like, you're so wrong. Like, I have played games all the way through that I would never normally play just because the narrative hooked me, and I was like, I need to know what's next. I need to see how this ends. Like, for example, Uncharted series, when I played the second one, that game is probably hands down one of my top 3 games of all time. And it's not because, I mean, it's a beautiful game, but the game is mostly like shooting and climbing and narrative. Like, it's like 3 things, and I don't really give a shit about shooting. And climbing is kind of fun because it's like semi-puzzly or whatever, but not really. But the narrative, Amy Hennig, I think, wrote it, and Richard LaMarchand like had their hands on it, and those two just, they made me like shooting games again, like for the first time since like Wolfenstein came out when I was a kid. That's how powerful narrative is to me. And so I feel like anyone that doesn't put it up there really high, like as high or close to it as the actual like game mechanics, is like leaving something on the table, basically.
well, and I think that mindset is sad, honestly, because mechanics are story. Just like action is story, so are mechanics. If a mechanic makes you feel anxious, then the story should be a part where you're feeling anxious. Like all of that goes together. And I think when we keep splitting it up, if a story feels repetitive, it's often because a mechanic feels repetitive. And we call that like game loop, and you do need that, but how do we also keep it fresh in the story, but also the mechanic itself, because they're all serving the same thing. It's one whole experience. So I feel like our need to divide them has kind of hurt us, and we need to make them friends again.
I think that's part and parcel of what I say when I say what I mean when I say narrative design. It's baking the story into the design, into the mechanics, into the animation, because I don't know if you all have this experience, but whenever I say, oh, I'm a game writer, they just think you write dialogue. And it's really about putting it in every aspect of the storytelling. Just like when you write a comic, it's not just like I wrote the dialogue, I wrote what happened on the page, and like the page turn and the arc of the story. And then of course the artist comes in and makes it a million times more amazing. But it really is about that. And I think it's important to value that there are games that don't have a narrative story, but they have an emergent narrative. So I always use an example is like Tetris. Like Tetris is a great game. Like you don't need to add narrative to it, but it still has an emergent narrative, which is like, oh, I'm pretty good at this. Wow, this is hard. Oh man, I suck. That's the emergent narrative. And I think that's the goal of games, is to make that emergent narrative as amazing as possible. And for narrative games, to give the environment, the context for that emergent narrative to have meaning to it.
Or even like games that don't have story or emergent, but have like characters. Like I play a lot of Battle Royale games, play a lot of Apex Legends, and like that doesn't really, I mean, in Extraneous Materials they have a story, but like the game itself does not really have a story, but the individual characters are so likable that it makes you want to continue playing, and their dialogue is great, and their relationships with each other keep me moving forward. And I think that this might just be personal preference, but like I don't really care about plot or story in any video game, comic book, or movie, like or TV show. I don't care what they're doing. Like I don't care what the like monster of the week is or whatever. I care about like if I like the characters enough and I care about their relationships with each other, I'm going to become invested in that game, comic, TV show, whatever it may be, regardless of what they're doing. Like nobody writes fan fiction about Supernatural because they care about the plot. No, nobody, right? So yeah.
That's a point I had never even thought of before, but it's yeah, I could see that. I think that evidence of fan fiction, especially when you see certain franchises that just like have epic oodles of it, and other ones may have a little bit less. It might speak to just literally how well people like the character. Or maybe they like the character interactions with each other, whatever it is. But I think that definitely speaks to volumes. You can activate, create something. That is probably one of the most powerful pieces of evidence in my mind for, having created something amazing in the first place. So, yeah, definitely there. Anybody else have answers on the fan reception? Love it, hate it, somewhere in between, anything like that?
I guess as far as read-only memories goes, one of the biggest goals spreading out from games for us was that you didn't have to play the game to read the comic. And so it's been very satisfying seeing in most reviews that a lot of the reviewers have never played the game, but never ever felt lost in the comic at all. So that's just something that I really like. And it's also the same for me. Like if I'm going into a comic that's based off of a game, most of the time I'm looking for the least possible effort to get into it. And if I have to play the game to read the comic, then that's effort wasted. Like I don't want to do that. So it's been very nice just seeing that. Obviously, if it's something like Sonic, you can just jump in wherever because it's whatever. But if it's something more in depth like Gears of War or whatever, do I have to play the game? Okay, well, but yeah, that's it.
In fairness, I feel incredibly intimidated by the Sonic book comics, and Sonic comic books, and I wouldn't know where to start. There's like 100 million volumes, and they're all like amazing. And you guys just sent me like a bunch of them recently, and I looked at them and I was like, there's so much deep Sonic lore.
There's so much lore.
It's amazing.
One of the really unique things about Sonic, and I don't mean to sidetrack this, but like there's probably a lot of Sonic readers who've never played the game, or a lot of people who are hardcore Sonic fans who do not come at it from the game. And that's probably the only game character, the only character that originated in the game that I would say that about. You know what I mean? And it's a kind of unique thing. There's a lot of comics like that now where there's a ton of people that are Captain America fans that have never read a comic, because they've seen the movies and played the games. But that didn't used to exist, 20 years ago. But Sonic's the one character. I mean, there's a generation of comic fans that was their comic, and they grew up with Sonic, and they grew up wanting to make comics because they wanted to make Sonic comics. It's a super weird, unique one.
It's actually pretty interesting too, looking at it, that whenever it comes to Sonic, the biggest effort to reading a Sonic comic is just reading more Sonic comics, not necessarily playing the game.
Yeah, Sonic comics, I think probably I mean, probably hands down the longest running video game based comic series. Because I mean, I remember them being on the grocery store shelves by the Archies forever. I mean, most of my life, I think, decades. So that's definitely like a unique one in that, and I'm so glad that they are continuing to do them because who doesn't love Sonic? I mean, but yeah, no, that's interesting, especially now that more things are adapting to new mediums. Like this probably will become a new trend, like where, like you said, the Captain America, like now people more know that character in that world because of the movies, not necessarily the origin medium, which is comics, but okay, let's see. We're actually approaching kind of the end of the hour, so if anybody has any final thoughts, feel free to share them now. Otherwise, we have about 8 minutes, I think. So we'll just wind it down, and then we can leave a couple extra minutes at the end in case people want to like answer questions. This is a pre-recorded panel, so when this goes live, there will be a text chat, and we can log in and answer stuff if we want. But final thoughts, John, do you want to do it first since you haven't been? Oh, I'm sorry, John Barber. We have two Johns in here.
Yeah, I think I was really thinking when everybody's talking about narrative, like when I got into gaming, you know, a few years ago, one of the, like two of the things that really attracted me to it were, I kind of think there's nowhere more interesting right now in terms of storytelling than indie gaming. Like I think the stuff that's come out, you know, just, you know, having this overview of 30 years, 40 years of gaming, all hitting me all at once. Like stuff in the last 10 years from, you know, from Gone Home through Oxenfree was one that struck me as being really interesting, the way the story was told. And that was a story you couldn't tell in other ways. Yeah. Night in the Woods was one that really struck me, where the gameplay was so integrated into the story. You know, like that kind, those kind of things really, I mean, obviously Read Only Memories is one that pulled me in. I mean, that's not a joke. That's why I reached out to these guys. Was, you know, I was aware of the stuff that it sort of builds on, but it was such an interesting take on how to interact with you know, something like cyberpunk stuff was something that I was very into, you know, forever. And the way it interacted with that, the aesthetic of it, but also just the way it plays out on the screen. All of that was so super interesting to me. And it reminds me of where like indie comics were in maybe the early 90s, not the Image comic stuff, but like the black and white comics that were coming out around the same time. Or what, you know, like what, some of the stuff people were doing to really kind of change the medium, and it in a completely different way. So that made me really excited. And then I think, you know, the narrative I was actually kind of down on 3D gaming, and it was Tomb Raider 2013. I put that on, and I was immediately pulled into Laura's story, and I 100% was like, oh, I don't want to kill that deer. I got to kill the deer. And then as soon as I killed a guy, I'm like, oh, these guys deserve it so much. My only complaint was that like my fire arrows didn't seem to hurt them more. Because what are they doing? I'm a grad student. Why are they coming after me? But I got so pulled into that story, you know, like, and that was one where I also think even on a AAA game like that those acts of the storytelling were, for me, totally worked and totally built into what the narrative was doing. And that's what excited me about it, was seeing this other medium of storytelling that I should have been paying attention to for years and hadn't been. So it was, you know, I don't know, it was humbling but exciting, you know, and I really liked it.
Well, you know, welcome back, first of all, to gaming, but also you probably looked at it with a different lens than maybe other people would have in a position that you were in, you know, to like take a fresh look at games, like as a person deep into editing comics and whatnot, you know, and looking at it as like a storytelling thing. Whereas if you had been playing it the whole time, you might have not come in with this fresh eyes. So maybe it was a benefit or blessing in disguise, benefit, whatever. But yeah. Let's see, I'll just go in a circle on my screen. So the next one would be Mary. Any final thoughts or things before we shut down?
I guess my final thought is just we should keep working together. Because you know, there's so much we can do in games to make players connect with a world and with a main character, but then there are so many opportunities to explore those worlds in more depth and explore those side characters more in comics that I feel like this is just the future. It was so exciting to get to work on Read Only Memories because I like the game too. You know, and get to even just write short stories about these characters I loved. And I feel like that's what we should be seeing more and more is rather than just adapting a story that already exists, let's keep building out like new adventures for these characters. Let's keep seeing them in ways we never have before. I think that's what really made the Read Only Memories comic by Sina so special, was it was something new but in a familiar universe. Like there was clearly both, and it was really nice.
Great. Sam, you're next on my screen.
Oh yeah, I mean, I just agree with what everybody's saying. I think that working across mediums as a creative is very gratifying. It keeps the writing fresh. It always makes you feel like I'm doing something new, even though it's technically all writing. It always feels like I'm doing something different, which is really fun. So from a creative perspective, it's great. And then like these folks have been saying, from a consumer or reader perspective or player perspective, it's also great because you get all these different ways to interact with characters or franchises or worlds that you love and you love to be in. I also want to say that my favorite movie to video game adaptation was the Scott Pilgrim video game, and I think it's a crime that you can't play it anywhere anymore. So if anybody watching knows how to fix that, I want it. I want that game back.
I've never been able to play it, and I was reading Scott Pilgrim from the first comic.
It's so good. It's like this amazing 2D like side scroller. The music, they just released the music from the game again. It's by Anna Managuchi, which is like so great. So if you can only listen to the soundtrack, but it's amazing. But oh man, it was very authentic. Like you could tell Brian Lee O'Malley and Oni were involved like every step of the process. Very authentic to the comic. Maybe one of the best examples I think of that kind of synergy. So if you could find like a playthrough or something on like a video, I would totally suggest watching it. It's adorable.
I feel like Scott Pilgrim in general is like the tightest example of like expanding through all three comic book, video game, movie mediums, and how they somehow managed to pack this, I forget how many volumes it was.
It was a lot.
6? Yeah, packing in 6 volumes of that into one movie. Oh yeah, there they are. And also packing all of it into just this one game that you can finish pretty much in one sitting was like really impressive. Like it is somehow able to be both short and long at the same time.
Sina, you're next in my order. Signing off thoughts. Oh, you're muted, I think, by the way.
I am muted. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. No, I don't have anything to say because everyone here has been saying it way better for the last hour. So I'm just grateful and I want more of everything. The end.
Cool. And
yeah, I want to echo, I think it was Mary who was saying that the importance of having quality in both media that you're translating from and to. I think Cade, what you were saying earlier about like, oh, just give your creatives freedom. I think that's important, but there's a difference between giving them freedom and not caring at all. Because I worked on an IP where the anchor medium clearly did not care at all about what we were doing and made it and completely nerfed our story because they didn't think it was important to tell us. So I think that's what's important is whoever the IP owner is, that they need to care about the medium that it's going into as much as they care about the medium it's coming out of. And although it can obviously be a challenge when the IP owner is going over everything you do with a fine-tooth comb, it can be a challenge. I prefer that at morning, noon, and night over someone who doesn't care at all and doesn't give you any feedback. And especially, like I remember when I was working on Halo when it was first announced, all the fans were like, "I'm so excited," and I was suddenly totally afraid that I was not gonna make the fans happy. But I was like, you know what? 343's got my back. They're gonna tell me if I do anything wrong. So that was really great to know that they were behind me, and I think that's what you want to give your creatives is that sense that like, you know, you've got their back.
Great. Well, thank you, everyone. We are just about at the end of the hour, I think. And
one last thing to say. I And that is, I think, the funnest thing that's happened so far as us expanding our game into comics was how much, because I pretty much trust writers 100%, feeling that they're infinitely more intelligent than I am at telling a story. So with that in mind, I think one of the funnest things was not only us informing the writing for the comic, but as the comic started to live on its own, having the story and that also sort of inform our own game as well. Since we're working on a sequel right now, the writing in the comic has sort of kind of given us even a better idea of how these characters might live on in this world and also our game and any further things. So it's fun seeing this like feedback loop of like the writing from the comic informing the game and the game informing the writing, this, that, and the other. That's it.
And then all we have to do, or I should say, I have to keep track of all the canon pieces and make sure that it's all kind of cohesive. Otherwise, I'm losing out my life. Anyway, thank you, everyone. And I hope the audience learned a couple of cool things and enjoyed it. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.